Hi everybody, today we'll be talking about chapter 1 on exploring forces and how it actually plays a role in our daily lives. So for this particular chapter, we'll be covering four main objectives. The first one is what are the effects of forces. Number two, how can forces be measured using instruments like your spring balance or your balance or electronic balance. Third, we will actually be discussing what are the effects of friction, which is an example of a force. And number four, how do simple machines work? Okay, so we'll be exploring the three classes of simple machine as well as the pulley systems. Okay. So basically, what is a force or what can a force do? A force can actually perform a few things. Okay, sorry. A force, what is a force? A force is defined by a push or a pull. Now, what is a push? What is a pull? So imagine there's a brick wall over here. It's a wall, and that you are at this end. So while you are trying to move towards the wall, you are in a way pushing against the wall. And when you're pushing against the wall, that is you exerting force onto the wall. On the other hand, you can also be in the direction of pulling against the wall. And this is also another example of a force. So through this simple example, you could see that force can actually be either a push or a pull. And what are some examples? Sometimes it's not just moving horizontally or along the plane of the floor. Instead, it can also be moving up or down, such as lifting. Lifting is an example of you trying to carry something up. Okay, you lifting an object, this is called lifting. Stretching is you pulling yourself wider, longer. Bending is basically something straight, and then from something straight you can actually bend at a particular angle, so that is bending. So that also requires force. Twisting is like, for example, when you're trying to dry your cloth or your or or an attire, and then what you do is you squeeze, you turn the thing in two different directions, either in the clockwise direction or in the anti-clockwise direction. So that will give you a twisting action. Okay, squeezing is in a way something like you pushing two things, like you fitting something and an object into a smaller container. That's an example of squeezing or squeezing each other. So those are some of the examples of forces where there are actions involved. So over here, like stretching a rubber band is one example where you're pulling. You're not so much of pushing, so this is a pulling action, and therefore it's a force. Tucking, like you pulling back the kite towards you while the wind actually blows in this direction. So that is also a force. Lifting, carry the heavy books upwards. Shaking allows it in two direction. Okay, movement. So rubbing your hands, and of course twisting, like opening a bottle cap. So these are examples of actions involving pushing or pulling. There are of course other examples of force which are non-contact. So when we look at force, right, there is two types of forces: contact force and non-contact force. So what are contact force? Contact force is where two surfaces are touching each other. Okay, that's the meaning of contact. Non-contact means you have nothing touching each other. In other words, right, what are some examples of force that doesn't involve touching each other? Magnetic force is one example, where in magnetic force you actually play a role of two magnets. Let's say you have a north pole and a south pole here, and another one over here. So if it's an unlike pole, they tend to be attracted to each other, and that is an example of a magnetic force. Okay, so you can see that they do not they are never in contact with each other, they are not touching each other. So this magnetic force is what we call non-contact force. Okay? Whereas friction, when you want to walk or anything, you are always against two different surfaces, and therefore friction is an example of a contact force because they are always touching each other. Okay? Then of course gravitational force. Gravitational force is another example of a non-contact force where what is actually pulling you into Earth is actually what we call gravity. So you don't really touch gravity, but in a way you also do know that something is pulling you towards the center of Earth. So what is friction force? Frictional force. Frictional force is an example whereby you have a particular two surfaces always in contact with each other, and they were always trying to prevent you from moving. Okay, so in other words, right, let's say I give you an example. You have a block of wood and you are pushing towards it in this direction. Okay, and let's say the road is actually quite rough. Okay, what you will do is, because of this roughness in surface, there will be an opposing force, and that's what we call friction. Okay, frictional force. So what exactly is frictional force? Frictional force is an opposing force. And it happens when there is two surfaces in contact. So it's another example of a contact force. So when we hold a glass of water, there is friction because number one, while gravity is pulling the glass below you, your hands actually is exerting another layer of forces against it so that the water do not actually the glass of water do not drop. So the ones that are highlighted in yellow, those are examples of your frictional force. As compared to the one in red, which is by gravitational force. So this is a gravitational, which is held by the weight of the glass of water. Magnetic force, on the other hand, is where the force is between two magnetic poles. Now there's only two types of magnetic poles. They are your north pole and your south pole. Okay, so for example, if you have a magnet, you have the north pole and the south pole. It can be attractive or repulsive depending on the type of poles. So if it's made up of one north, one south, okay, these are what we call unlike poles. Why unlike means they are not similar, therefore you will actually attract each other. So what is attract is basically they will come closer to each other. Okay, so that is an example of magnetic force. On the other hand, when you have like poles, for example, like this, when it's north to facing north, or it can be south facing south, they will tend to repel each other. They'll move in an opposite direction. And this is because like poles, they tend to repel one another. So these are the things you would have actually covered when you are in primary school. So next is gravitational force. What is gravitational force? Gravitational force is the force that pulls an object towards Earth. So imagine you have, this is Earth, and this is the center of Earth. So let's say you are standing in the center of Earth. There is indirectly a invisible force actually pulling you towards Earth. So even though you are standing, let's say, right, at the bottom of Earth, you are still actually, in a way, not floating around or not falling downwards. you're in a way still grounded to the center at the X area. And this is held because of gravitational force, the force that pulls an object towards the Earth. Now you will need to know what are some of the examples of the effects of force. This is important as it usually comes out as an exam question where you are required to discuss what are some of these effects either in MCQ or in structure. So first of all, a force can change the shape or size of an object. So this is the first point. What we meant by shape is that something that might be in a cylindrical shape like this, it eventually becomes into another shape that is different from the original. So this is very flat, correct? So this is an example. Second thing is, do you see the size also change from something so tall, now it's something so short? So in a way, by exerting force, you can either change the shape of the object or basically the size of the object. Second thing is force can also change the motion. Motion meaning that that means the object is already moving, movement, object movement. So when we are talking about object movement, there is two ways. It either moves faster, so we are talking about faster, slower, start to move, stop movement, stop moving. So these are generally four main areas where we are talking about movement. So a force is able to make sure that you actually have these four examples. So when we say stationary, the meaning of stationary means it is not moving at the start. It is not moving at all. So when we say move a stationary object, it means that we are actually moving something that is not moving initially. That means like let's say you have your water bottle on the table is stationary, it's not moving. But when you push it, right, the water bottle will actually move from its original position. Second thing is to stop a moving object. So it's like you imagine you are like there's actually a bicycle coming towards you. You stand there and you actually use two hands to stop the bicycle from moving you. And if the bicycle stop, you have already exerted force. You have stopped a moving object. Then of course changing a moving object is like, for example, let's say your friend is already running and you want to push him to go faster, you push him at the back. So in that sense, that's also an example of a force. Changing the direction is another one whereby let's say you are moving forward, then let's say a friend pulls you from the side. So your friend has actually you have actually changed in direction. Rather than moving forward, you move to the side, to the left or right. So that's another example of changing the direction of a moving object. So a force can exert these four main change in movement as well. So is it seen in everyday life? Number one, like let's say you kick a soccer ball. We use soccer as an example, where the ball is initially stationary, okay? And then the person actually kick the ball. So when you start to kick the ball, this ball starts to move away. So from something that is not moving, you suddenly kick it and then it's moving. So that is what we meant by a force can move a stationary object. Second thing is making it roll slower or faster. You either stop the ball, that's one, or you change, or you're actually hitting it and then it spins even faster in a different arrangement. So this is mainly to do with speed. Next is direction. So direction is like you kicking the ball forward, then slowly when you suddenly see someone is in front of you, an opponent in front of you, you want to change the direction of the ball, so you kick to the side. So that is another example of how force can actually play a role to change the direction. Okay, so we have come to the end of discussing what are the effects of forces. Um, do pause the video, think about how you can actually recap what you have learned. You should be able to answer, for example, what are some examples of forces, what are contact forces, what are non-contact forces, how to define a force, how to define magnetic force, how to define gravitational force, and how to define frictional force. You should also be able to explain what are the different effects of forces and how it is applied to a given scenario. So If you want, you can pause here for today and then continue the next lesson by clicking the button over here for the next video, and of course remember to subscribe and like the video. Thank you.